The shortcut for special passengers. The rain over Blackwater wasn't falling. It was attacking. It was a solid, roaring wall of water that turned the world into a swirling, phosphorescent smear of neon and shadow. For me, Liam Croft and my girlfriend, Chloe, just stepping out of Blackwater International Airport felt like being plunged into a cold, hostile ocean after the sterile, recycled air of our 12-hour flight. Every nerve, already frayed by travel fatigue, was now jangling with a raw, primal alertness. We were desperate for a semblance of warmth and normality, for the rented apartment on Raven's End that promised a week of exploring a city we'd only seen in movies. We tumbled into the first available cab, an old boxy sedan that looked like a relic from a bygone era, its yellow paint muted under a film of grime and rain. The moment the door slammed shut, the world outside muted to a dull roar, and a new, intimate dread took its place. The interior smelled of a cloying, failed attempt to mask deeper sins, cheap pine air freshener battling the ghosts of stale cigarette smoke, damp upholstery, and that faint coppery tang. The metallic hint of a bitten penny, of blood. Chloe, usually a vibrant burst of energy who could chat with anyone, shrunk into herself. She pressed against me, her damp shoulder digging into mine, a silent communication of shared unease. "This car smells like a hospital," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. I just squeezed her hand, my eyes fixed on the back of the driver's head. He was a gaunt man, his neck a corded stalk rising from the collar of a worn leather jacket. He hadn't spoken a word, merely grunted when I'd given the address. 17 Raven's End. Now he drove with an unnerving stillness, his hands resting lightly on the wheel at 10 and 2 as if following a manual only he could see. We left the bright, chaotic artery of the airport highway and plunged into the city's veins. The buildings here were tall, Victorian, leaning over the narrow streets like disapproving giants. The few functioning streetlights cast weak, jaundiced pools of light that served only to deepen the consuming darkness between them. The GPS on my phone stuttered, the icon spinning uselessly before the screen went entirely black. "Signal's gone," I said, my voice too loud in the oppressive silence. "Hey mate, you sure you know where you're going? Raven's End in the old town?" For a long moment, there was no response but the swish of the wipers and the opera. He had turned on the stereo minutes ago, a crackling recording of Turandot. Now, Lou's lament wasn't just sad. It was a mournful warning, a soundtrack to a descent into hell. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak of vertebrae, he turned his head. Not to glance in the mirror. He turned his whole head to look directly at us. His face was long, pale, and utterly devoid of expression. His eyes were the worst part, flat, black, and depthless, like chips of obsidian. They held no life, no curiosity, no malice. Nothing. They were the eyes of something that had stopped being human a long, long time ago. It was in that frozen moment that I saw it. Just above the stained collar of his jacket, a small flesh-colored band-aid was peeling at the edge, and from beneath it, peeking out, was a scar. It was impossibly neat, a perfect horizontal line that wrapped around the entire circumference of his neck, a hair-thin surgical line. It looked as if his head had been carefully removed and then reattached. A cold that had nothing to do with the rain flooded my veins. Chloe, who hadn't yet met his gaze, felt the shift in me. "Sir?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. "Is everything all right?" He smiled. It was a terrifying, mechanical motion. The corners of his mouth stretched upwards, but his dead eyes remained unchanged, fixed on us. The skin around his mouth didn't crinkle, it just stretched like clay on a doll. "Don't worry." His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dust and bones. "I know a shortcut. I always know a shortcut for such." Special passengers. My mind raced. Special passengers. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He turned back, and the car abruptly swerved. Tires squealing against the wet cobblestones, plunging into an alley so narrow I heard the screech of paint scraping against brick on both sides. The car jerked to a halt. The engine died with a final shudder. Suddenly, the only sounds were the relentless hammering of the rain on the metal roof and the haunting hissing aria of the dead slave girl from the speakers. We were boxed in, a dead end. High, windowless brick walls rose on three sides, streaked with damp and moss. The air smelled of stagnant water and rotting garbage. "I believe we have arrived," the driver said, and turned to face us completely. In his hand was not a knife or a gun. It was a tool, long, maybe 10 inches, and made of polished surgical steel. It looked like an awl or a grotesquely large stitching needle, one end tapering to a vicious point, the other thickened into a handle that fit perfectly in his grasp. It caught the dim green light from the dashboard and glinted with a cold, sterile promise. Chloe let out a choked sob and recoiled against the door. I yanked at the handle, locked. I slammed my shoulder against the door. It didn't budge. He was in no hurry. He watched our panic with that same cold, clinical detachment, like an entomologist observing insects trapped in a jar. "You are so loud," he rasped, his eyes fixed on me. "Your hearts, your breathing, so noisy. I will help you find silence, eternal silence." Adrenaline, sharp and metallic, exploded in my mouth. My vision tunneled. This is it. This is how it ends. My gaze darted around the cabin, looking for a weapon, for anything. It landed on a heavy, old-fashioned metal thermos lodged in the door pocket. Without thinking, acting on pure animal instinct, I grabbed it and with a guttural yell, smashed it against the side window. The wet, tempered glass didn't shatter but cobwebbed into 1,000 fractures with a sound like a gunshot. The driver flinched back, a flicker of genuine surprise and then rage, finally animating his dead features. His carefully constructed mask of calm shattered. He lunged across the seat, the awl aimed at my throat. But that split second of surprise was all we needed. Chloe, screaming now, slapped her hand wildly across the central console, hitting every button. A loud thunk echoed through the car. The door locks disengaging. She shoved her door open and tumbled out into a deep, foul puddle. "Liam, run!" I shoved my shoulder against the fractured window. It bulged outward. I kicked it, and the entire webbed pane exploded outwards in a cascade of glass diamonds. I scrambled through, the sharp edges tearing at my jacket, and fell onto the wet, slippery cobblestones. He was out of the car now, unfolding himself to his full, unsettling height. He was taller than I'd realized, a gaunt spectre against the brickwork. "Run, run," his voice boomed, echoing monstrously in the confined space, mingling with the opera's climax. It makes the game more interesting. We ran. We didn't look back. We abandoned our suitcases, our passports, our world in that tomb on wheels. We slipped on the wet stones, our breaths coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, fueled by a terror so pure it was blinding. We burst out of the alley onto a slightly broader but no less dark street, a single flickering street light, and a door with a faint light behind the glass. We threw ourselves at it, pounding on the solid wood with our fists, screaming, our voices raw and broken. A light came on inside. Bolts slid back. The door opened to reveal an elderly man in a tartan robe, his face a mask of alarm and confusion. He took in our drenched, terrified forms, our wild eyes. "We need help. He's trying to kill us," I gasped, pushing Chloe inside before stumbling in after her. The man, Mr. Henderson, as we later learned, peered out into the rain-swept night. The alley was empty. The street was empty. There was no yellow cab, no tall, thin man. Nothing but the rain and the wind howling through the narrow passageways. The police came. They were polite, professional, and utterly skeptical. There was no record of a cab with that number plate, no reports of a driver matching that description. Our story, of a man with a scarred neck and a surgical awl, sounded like the shared hallucination of two jet-lagged paranoid tourists. They filed a report, a meaningless gesture lost in a sea of paperwork. But as the police car prepared to take us to a hotel, I looked back one last time through the rain-streaked window, and I saw him. He was standing deep in the shadow of a stone archway across the street, perfectly still, just watching, and in his hand, held loosely at his side, was that same steel instrument catching a sliver of light. Slowly, deliberately, he brought his other hand up, a single pale finger extending to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Shh! Then he smiled. That same dead, doll-like smile. And then he was gone. The aftermath was a different kind of prison. Chloe developed a crippling fear of taxis, of narrow streets, of the rain. The sound of opera music made her physically ill. We tried to move on, to bury the memory deep. But it was a ghost that lived with us, in the spaces between our words, in the quick, nervous glances over our shoulders. I became a writer. I suppose it was a way to exert control over the narrative, to put monsters on a page where they could be contained and defeated. I told stories, but sometimes, on nights when the rain fell in a particular way, I would find myself pausing, my heart hammering, and I would peer out into the street, looking for a shape in the shadows. I told myself it was over. A traumatic event, now a decade past. I was wrong. It happened last night. The same relentless Blackwater rain. I was leaving a bar after a book signing, my mind still buzzing with the artificial high of performance and cheap wine. I fumbled for my umbrella, looking up and down the slick, empty street for a cab, and then I saw it. Parked directly across the street under a broken streetlight was a car, an old, boxy sedan. Its for-hire light was dark. And behind the wheel, barely visible through the curtain of rain, was a silhouette. A gaunt, familiar silhouette, head turned in my direction. Ice water dumped into my stomach. The world narrowed to that car, that window, that shape. The wine-induced buzz evaporated, replaced by a sober, crystalline terror. I dropped my umbrella, my keys clattering on the wet pavement. I scrambled for them, my hands shaking uncontrollably, my breath catching in my throat. I finally yanked my car door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks down. The sound was a tiny, pathetic defense against the void outside. Gasping, I dared to look. His car began to move. It rolled forward silently, with an unnatural smoothness, until it was perfectly parallel to mine. Through 2 layers of rain-streaked glass I saw his face, older, more lined, but the eyes were identical. Black, empty sockets. He wasn't holding the steering wheel. In his right hand, resting casually on the dashboard, was the awl. He held my gaze, and with a terrifying, slow deliberation, he raised the point of the instrument. He didn't point it at me. Not yet. First he drew its cold, sharp tip slowly across his own temple, tracing a line. Tracing the memory of that perfect, impossibly neat scar. Then, and only then, did he slowly turn the instrument. He raised his arm, and the sharp, glinting point was aimed directly at me. It was a gesture of unmistakable intent, a promise. A period placed on a story I had foolishly believed was finished. His engine roared to life, a sudden violent sound in the silent night. The tires screeched on the wet asphalt, and the car shot forward, disappearing around a corner and into the swallowing darkness of Blackwater. The police found nothing, of course. The cameras on the street had, they claimed, been malfunctioning due to the storm. So now I sit here by my window, watching the rain paint rivulets down the glass. I am not writing anymore. I am waiting. I listen for the sound of an engine idling, too long outside. I dread the glance into a rearview mirror, because he is no longer just a memory. He is an author, too. And he has decided that my ending was unsatisfactory. He has returned to edit it. He hasn't forgotten the ones who got away, the one who told his story. And I know, with a certainty that chills my soul, that he is out there, in the rain, in the darkness. He knows a shortcut.